I run cultures based on high-end Michelin star hospitality. Like Danny Meyer's Setting the Table is literally my culture book. So using that hospitality mindset to come in, again, that's not for everybody. But the thing we're really talking about here, which I think is important, is that why writing your culture down and defining the culture you want to be early on is so important is that it will magnetize the right people and it will detract the right people. But if you just say, we want to be remote first, or we want to be people first, but we don't actually know what that means, we haven't made a decision to define what that means for us, that leads to massive confusion. It's incredibly expensive. Turnover is incredibly high. You go through this mismatching of values, whereas a lot of these problems that companies are dealing with at the moment, they can solve them beforehand. And I would encourage anybody who's out there, especially in a small team, 50 or under, people ops leaders who are listening to this, one of the best things you can do right now is to start putting definitions to the words that you have on your employer brand, on your job descriptions, and on your employee journey.
Hey everyone, welcome to Leading from Afar, a show by remote leaders for remote leaders, where we dive into the most important topics facing leaders in the future of work. I'm your host, Scott Markovitz. I was the first hire at Envision, one of the first all-remote companies back in 2012. I've since helped build and scale multiple remote teams as an early employee or consultant. In each episode, we geek out doing deep dives on specific topics like within async, hiring the best talent anywhere, how to create a fun and engaging environment remotely, and so much more. This show was created to help managers leading remotely upskill themselves to help them build world-class remote cultures. If you enjoy this content, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, share it with friends and colleagues, and feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website. Everyone, thanks for tuning in to today's show with me, Scott Markovitz. If you've been searching for the authoritative episode on building remote culture, well, happy to say that you're in the right place today. Today, I'm joined by Darcy Boles, and there's definitely a reason why Darcy is one of the most sought after remote leaders and thinkers. This episode was pure brilliance, and the conversation really could have lasted all day long. We spoke about things that are and the ideas that are truly at the heart of remote cultures at the best companies, why documentation is so important to remote work, who owns remote culture, is it the executive team, is it the employees, HR, or anywhere in between, and when does culture really start and end, and a whole lot more. So, hope you enjoy it. Hey Darcy, how you doing? How's everything in sunny San Diego?
Hi, Scott. It's good. It's actually not very sunny right now, which is very odd for us. We're getting a ton of rain, but we need it.
Is that possible? I thought in like San Diego, it's 365 days of just sun and like mid 70s just every day.
You know, I did too when I moved here, and I think I might have brought some Oregon rain with me. So it might be my fault.
So I guess the neighbors aren't overly excited that you moved into town. Amazing. So usually the way we start off these episodes is pretty simple. Maybe just tell everyone a little bit more about yourself. I don't think you necessarily need so much of an introduction, but it's always good to have one. And tell us a little bit more about your experience leading remote teams and organizations. Because I think when we first connected years ago, you were working with TaxJar, and then to what you're doing these days.
Yeah, so I'm really stoked to be here, Scott. I know we've been friends online for a long time, and this has been kind of in the works to have this podcast. I'm really happy it's happening. So I'm Darcy. I live in Southern California in San Diego. It's my home base, but I do something that you may have heard the term slow mad. So it's kind of going someplace for a month and working and kind of integrating into the culture. So I spend a lot of time in Mexico, just being so close, and I love the language and the food. So I'm there a lot as well. So leading remote teams, I've been leading remote teams since about 2016. And before that, I was working for Airbnb. So I was working kind of globally across global cultures and doing some remote work pilots because, believe it or not, remote work had yet been brought to the world, even to an incredibly forward-thinking tech company at the time. And yeah, so I joined Taxstar in 2017. And was their director of culture and innovation for 4 years until we went through a very large acquisition into Stripe Tax, which was super cool. But it was really interesting to have been in the remote space and been connected with people like you kind of pre-pandemic. So I've kind of been through that journey of how to successfully set up a profitable remote company without any concept of having an office, like remote first from inception. How do you scale that and that rhythm, as well as kind of, especially moving into Stripe and what I do now, seeing kind of reaction to remote. How are companies adapting to the demands of flexibility from workers, but also going through that mindset shift of, could we be working better remotely? Like, what does the future of work look like for us? And so now I'm doing some in the consulting realm, and I'm helping companies really with remote culture. So companies already have a culture. Their culture already exists, but a lot of times when you go remote, that culture isn't written down. And culture is a feeling. And so what I do now from a fractional head of remote capacity, as well just to consult culture coaching and consulting, is helping companies identify what their culture is and put language around it so then they can hold themselves accountable to it, as well as help people assimilate to the environment faster.
That's super exciting. And I think number one for Mexico City, I've heard that's like the next up and coming remote hub. I think Lisbon kind of gets all the accolades these days being the remote capital, but I think from at least what I've heard, especially from people in the States, because obviously Mexico is so close, similar to in Europe, Lisbon being so close, the Mexico City is becoming the hot place for remote. That's very interesting. And there's tacos at every corner. I'm like, how much better could you get? That's like a dream.
There's tacos on every corner. There's incredible restaurants. The culture is amazing. And not just Mexico City. Mexico in and of itself is just this incredible land. And there's so much to explore. And I've just really fallen in love with the country.
That's so cool. I've been there, I think, twice. And it was a great time when I was there. And I definitely need to get back, especially for the tacos. But that's not what this episode is about today. And at least I'm super excited today to be geeking out, doing a deep dive on culture. Very much passionate about company culture. I'm very much a believer in, I've spoken to 1,300 plus founders over the years. And I don't think I've ever met one who says, oh yeah, we have a great company culture. We do that. I could probably, in theory, count on two hands how many companies truly have great company culture. With all the things that are out there, again, most companies aren't doing it right. So I'm excited to really kind of just really dig into this topic today with you, because I know you've spent so much time focusing on this as well. So the first kind of question I'm going to lead off is, this culture is obviously very unique to each company. I know, especially during when the pandemic hit and everyone was trying to figure out how to do, and everyone's like, let's just kind of copy what GitLab does. And GitLab has done some amazing things, but only GitLab is GitLab. And everyone needs to kind of take some of the things they've done and obviously do what's best for them. But when you look at remote companies, are there some specific fundamentals that are at the heart of great remote companies and great remote culture? And if there are, why is each one of them so important, so foundational?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get a little theoretical with this, if that's okay. You know, Please. I think that any remote company can be thought of like a three-legged stool, and it needs three things to really thrive. And it's how these three things intersect. And that's culture, communication, and technology. And I'm actually going to define each one of these as well to just go a little deeper. So culture is the collective consciousness of what a group of people says, feels, thinks, and does together. It's really how a team works together. There's communication, is how that culture is communicated, both synchronously and asynchronously. And then there's technology, where that culture and communication is held. It's the container in which that's held. And so I think really starting to think about those three things as the pillars of how remote companies can be successful. And they can say, okay, what is our culture? Have we defined our culture? Do we know what it is? How do we communicate it? And where do we communicate it? And are those three things always in alignment with one another? And really thinking of it like a Venn diagram can be really, really helpful in thinking about, okay, these are the three things we really need to focus on a macro level.
Okay, I can definitely hear that and definitely makes sense. So one of the things that I think about a lot when it comes to company culture, and I like to argue with companies that I come across, is the idea of when is there a begin date and an end date to company culture? Like, is it the culture starts on the first day of onboarding and it ends on, let's say, the last day that they are with the company? So is there a specific start date, end date? And if there's different kind of milestones, if there's certain kind of items, is there, or maybe can you define a couple of culture pieces or culture items in each one of, let's say, those milestones that really differentiate the world-class remote cultures from basically what everyone else is doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say culture starts at the start date that the founder has an idea to start a company, right? Like, culture is truly it's the expression of the way a founding team sees the world, and it's the way they think things should work in an environment. And ideally, with a lot of founding teams, those things are aligned, right? And so that's where it really starts. It's at the breadth of that moment of, we're going to start a company. What is this going to look like? How do we want to work? And then really starting to express that through action. So that's where I would say it starts. I don't think it ever ends. Culture is a living organism. It's really kind of like an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that needs to survive in different weather patterns. And, you know, a culture that's made for a small to medium-sized business market is probably not going to be as successful in an enterprise market, because that culture has learned and functioned how to survive the weathers of the storm of the small to medium-sized business market. So I think that's one thing to really note, that culture is, you can have an incredible culture, but if it doesn't align with the market you're in, it doesn't really matter for business success. So that's just number one thing I'll say. Really thinking about the moments, right? These really important cultural moments. I'd encourage us to start defining those as pieces of culture. What's the language that people use? Do people use a lot of slang? Is English the language that people use primarily? Is it a different language? Are there these certain cultural words that companies use? Starting to define that language. Starting to think about rituals. So if there's a birthday or anniversary or a celebration, especially onboarding, right? What are the rituals that happen in those moments? And I really think this goes all the way. If you kind of ask the question, like, what are these moments that happen? I would say, you know, expressing culture really happens at the moment that your employer brand is out there attracting candidates and attracting customers. So really that messaging is very similar. And then it goes all the way to retire. So from hire to retire, and these moments, these really important moments, welcoming, so onboarding, learning and development, connecting with people, celebrations, going through hard times, how you have rituals around hard times, how do you communicate as a company culture when those moments happen, is really important part of seeing that culture red thread through the entire employee experience from hire to retire.
Interesting. So I think maybe I'll pivot or re-ask on the question a little bit in a different way, because I think you gave some great examples, and I actually want to maybe deep dive in a couple of these moments of the culture lifetime of the company. I think maybe what I was thinking of, had in mind, so I'll kind of rephrase, of the lifetime of the employee. You know, things, again, that I've thought about when I see companies, again, they talk about culture, blah, 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 but on the job rec, now, unless you're in California or New York, you don't have a salary band on there. Or you go through multiple rounds of interviews, and all of a sudden, radio silence. So like the follow-up. So kind of like in that experience, like, where does that company culture for, let's say, the individual person who potentially, I guess, in theory, let's say, is joining the company, start and end? Again, is it all the way back in the job rec itself? There are certain items that are in the job rec that should be there. in the interview process, it should be a good or bad, when they're onboarding, like buddy systems, when they have those moments. And again, I want to deep dive into those moments of if something, God forbid, somebody goes through something, like what does that, again, experience look like? Or maybe examples that you've had, again, it shouldn't happen to anybody, but some examples that you may have come to in your career where something has happened to somebody and what you and the company have done for them to help them get through whatever they're experiencing. And to the end, okay, now they're moving on. And like, what does that look like? Are they moving on because they've kind of hit a glass wall, because they, whatever the reason is, and kind of what pieces, again, make a great culture of, even when somebody's leaving, what does a company try to do to make sure that they have a better culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we can probably define this. I'll reiterate, it absolutely goes from the moment somebody sees that employer brand, sees that job description. And then it's really important that what they read in that job description and the experience they have matches when they actually get into the company. You hear a lot of people say, oh, I applied, they said I was a remote, now I have to be in the office. Like, that's actually cultural misalignment, and that creates distrust in the culture in the company. So again, coming down to, you kind of ask what's a better culture than another. I mean, I think it defines on the culture you want to be. If you're a people first culture, I would say that's really how I would define a better type of culture. Are we putting our people first? Are we focusing on being really honest about the experience they're coming into? Is the culture we've said we have, are the values we state that we have, are those living and breathing? And really, by writing your culture down in remote, you're then able to hold yourself and your teams accountable to who we say we are and who we want to be. I think that's a really essential part here. And coming back to your question around like hard times with people, I mean, the reality of remote is really, in remote culture, is that every employee is in a similar storm, but in a very, very different lifeboat. And so I think as a company, people have to decide, are we going to be a culture of care? Are we going to be a people first culture? And if you are, then strategizing how to support those people in those moments. Like, I think that's probably one of the most important things. I will remember, I had just joined TaxStars, this was a really long time ago, and I was going through a horrible breakup. I had to take some time off. The next day, there were flowers on my doorstep from my team, and it meant the world to me. And part of that was because we had a culture. Part of our business plan was to have a budget for when these things happen to our employees, to have a team that focused on these moments, that was always checking in. Not everybody's going to share that they have a breakup, but just knowing that we have resources, we have a budget, we are a culture that cares, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is. And I think that's the difference between just saying you're one culture or another. You're actually proving to do it, and you're giving your teammates permission that it's a culture of care. And that's another thing that's really important, because a lot of people haven't experienced cultures of care. And so it's a new concept for a lot of individuals. And so it really needs to be exemplified by the leadership for that to be culturally relevant and for people to trust the culture.
I love that. And I want to kind of bring out one point of what you said. I absolutely love speaking to other leaders, remote other leaders, for the opportunity for me, right, to learn, it kind of changed my mindset. I've forever have been a believer in every company should be a people first company, right? Simple. If you break down a success of a company all the way to the bottom, it's make your employees happy, right? Happy employees make happy customers, right? The other way works around. So everything you should do should be employee first. But having that mindset of, yes, we are a people first, or if the founders, hey, it's the business first. Okay, that maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. I guess maybe who am I to argue? I can argue certainly for one side, and maybe that's wrong, but for another side, it's not.
Yeah.
But being able to set up, hey, this is what we believe in, right? Elon Musk, hey, we believe that we're an office-based company, right? Wrong, or boat is great, whatever it is. That's right? At Twitter or whatever, companies for Tesla, being an office-based company is what works for them. And leave it at that. And putting that through. And what I like kind of the second point is when, let's say you're going to be a people first company, and the things, again, the hope from the podcast is really for like these small little takeaways. It's saying, hey, because we're people first, we know people are going to go through moments, both happy and wonderful moments, and unfortunately, maybe the other side of moments. So there should be a budget, a moment budget, right? When somebody runs some moment, an anniversary, a birthday, a wedding, or on the other side, hey, there's a budget that we
wooing budget.
Yes, a wooing budget. I love it.
It's a wooing budget.
I love it. I love it. But having, again, that's part of the culture of, hey, we're people first, and we want to celebrate or be comforting or being supporting and honoring these moments. And like those little things are kind of what counts. And again, I just love these little ideas because for me, again, it's people first, right? That's the only type of company you could run. If you're not a people first company, like you shouldn't be in business. But again, maybe that's not necessarily true. That's the kind of business I want to run and I want to be in. But on the other side, it may not be. And I saw a great post from Valentina Thorner the other day.
I have a call for this afternoon.
Yeah, great. So you can tell her we spoke about her today. Yeah. And she had a post the other day saying, I've always personally been against the idea of hiring regionally, right? That's just terrible. Remote culture. You have to hire everywhere, whatever. That's what we did in Vision. We hired the best anywhere. But you had the specific point that if you're hiring locally or regionally, because the fact is, hey, we would like to actually get the team together 3-4 times a year. And we only have a certain amount of budget. So if you're hiring anywhere and globally, maybe once a year would be too expensive for the company to get together. But if you're setting up for the right intention, right? We want everybody in the US East Coast or in Central Europe, not because we want synchronous work or not because it's a cost or whatever. It's because, hey, we want to get together. And the only way we're going to be able to afford to get everyone together, because we understand how important it is by being in one space. And at first I saw that, I'm like, no. And afterwards I'm like, that's very interesting.
It's smart, right? And I think it's like, I'm in the same camp of you. I've always been a people first person. My background is in hospitality, and I believe in nothing other than a hospitality standard culture. Like I run cultures based on high end Michelin star hospitality. Like Danny Meyer's Setting the Table is literally my culture book. So using that hospitality mindset to come in, again, that's not for everybody, but the thing we're really talking about here, which I think is important, is that why writing your culture down and defining the culture you want to be early on is so important, is that it will magnetize the right people and it will detract the right people. But if you just say, we want to be remote first, or we want to be people first, but we don't actually know what that means, we haven't made a decision to define what that means for us, that leads to massive confusion. It's incredibly expensive. Turnover is incredibly high. You go through this mismatching of values, whereas a lot of these problems that companies are dealing with at the moment, they can solve them beforehand. And I would encourage anybody who's out there, especially in a small team, 50 or under, people ops leaders who are listening to this, one of the best things you can do right now is to start putting definitions to the words that you have on your employer brand, on your job descriptions, and on your employee journey, like defining what that means. We're going through a rebrand of work right now, and it allows everyone to be a culture architect, to be a people operations designer. And that is a liberty that we did not have on a social scale before the pandemic. And it really, really, the more that you can define those things, it's like a dating app. The more that you say what you're looking for and who you are, and the more vulnerable and honest you are and a follow through, the more you're going to attract those people into your life. And it's the exact same thing with the job description and the employee journey.
Love it. I couldn't agree more. I want to now focus on something that I think, unfortunately, we've seen quite a bit in the last 6+ months on this kind of this, let's say, employee journey of the offboarding, right? We went through 6 months of those useless CEO emails of, I'm so sorry, I had to put the company and the investors first, and like all that kind of stuff. And like, just those things made me sick. But focusing on the offboarding of whether it's, the company's downsizing or company, maybe employees are leaving, are there, again, specifics in there that are like those best practices that companies should invest in when people are leaving? Again, hopefully for good reasons, or even in cases where they're not. So things like ideas of exit interviews, especially when people are maybe leaving on their own. Like, what did we get wrong, and what did we miss, and how could we improve? And obviously those things around that. Things around like severance and references, and not, for me, the idea of, oh, here's like some Airtable list of all these awesome employees who I highly recommend, versus, hey, I'm the founder. I know these couple companies are still hiring. I'm going to personally reach out to that CEO and say, hey, I see you're looking for this and this role. Here's the people you want. And like maybe what that looks like. And like similar things like that. Are there, keeping equipment, whatever, what have you, are there like those best practices that remote companies should be embracing on the offboarding piece of the life cycle of an employee?
Absolutely. And I will quote Patty McCord, who was the VP of People at Netflix for 14 years, when they say this: think about your offboarding in a way that you are a great place to be from. You want people speaking highly about your organization because you might be going through another hiring spree in a few years once things calm down. Like, you want to keep that longevity and not burn bridges. And so I think that's number one, right? Like, how are you creating an experience that is a great place to be from? I think also consistently throughout the employee journey, not just at the end, talking about that nothing is ever wonderful all the time, and really helping your employees become resilient in change. And I think that's part of the process, not just in offboarding, but consistently. I see a lot of cultures like, this is great, this is great, this is great, and not acknowledging we've just been through an insane pandemic. Parents are having a really hard time. Like, focus is an all-time low at the moment. I see you pointing at yourself. Yeah, like acknowledging that consistently, and like having book clubs on here. One of my favorite books is by Dr. Edith Eger, and she wrote The Choice. She was in a Holocaust camp, in a detainment camp for years, and she's a psychologist now. And reading those books as a group in different situations, just saying when things come up, we can do hard things, and building that resilience muscle. I think that's part of life and something that a company can choose to do to offer their employees. Now, back to kind of the offboarding piece. Yes, exit interviews. If you're doing exit interviews, you should be doing stay interviews as well. Once a year, right? Like, why do you stay? Why would you recommend this place to a friend? Then you can start really building on those things before it becomes a problem. I think too, really having a package of resources. I would even go as far to say hiring somebody kind of before or no, like even middle of the learning and development journey to help people understand LinkedIn better, to help beef up their LinkedIn profile, not just because they might be doing a layoff, but because it's just good social practice to have. It's a great thing for the company to have their employees doing. If you do that as part of the journey, those people are already way more set up for success at the end of this than they would have been if you hadn't integrated something like that. I would also say having a package and just having templates to help people apply for jobs. Here are some best practices. I think that's the thing that people get stuck with most. They feel at the end of this like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I'm not worthy. And giving people a lot of resources to here's what's worked, here's what hasn't, for people who applied here at the beginning would be really, really, really helpful and really supportive. So I think versus just having kind of all of this volunteer stuff thrown on, really having that kind of offboarding package tied up with a bow, while also thinking about someday we might have to do layoffs. Are there things that we can integrate into our L&D, into our employee experience as part of the journey that would benefit us now and also support employees later if they choose to leave, is a really smart way to think about it.
That is just so fantastic, especially the point, it's something that I've argued and people have debated with me, of the thought of what happens when someone leaves, or again, that side, what happens one day if we need to cut staff. Like, you should be thinking about these things way early on, right? I remember one of the first things I ever did in my career was my first job. I had to create this document called the OSS document, basically, or I'm going to throw a curse out here, so you feel free to know. It was called the oh shit. It was the oh shit scenario. That in the event that, I think this was like after 9/11, I think it was right after the time in the Northeast, there was like a blackout that lasted for whatever it was. Like in this event, what happens? In that event, like all these different kind of crazy scenarios that will likely probably never happen. But we are thinking about them long ahead of time. And this is something that I've tried to push on companies. Hey, you should be thinking about this. In the event you need to fire somebody, or people need to leave, or there's downsides, right? You should know what an optimal setup looks like. And amazingly, what you said, start investing in it during the time, right? Get an expert for a LinkedIn profile, get in learning development, like start investing in them. So at the times that they leave, whether hopefully voluntarily versus not,
right,
they're set up, they're much more in a place of being set up for success versus what do we do now? Let's try to figure out and scramble together, try and be as nice as we can, and hopefully not get a negative rating on Glassdoor.
Yeah, exactly. I love the oh shit document. I totally agree with that. I think it's so important to just be thinking about that employee journey for such a long time. I mean, the opening and closing of any meeting, of any experience is basically the most memorable, right? Like you're going to remember how you were treated and what your experience was the moment you join that company and the moment you leave, so much more than the moment in between. And the way you bookend that is so telling of your culture and how much you do or don't care, frankly, in the employee experience.
100%. I want to again dive into something that you had mentioned before, and which seems to be a very commonplace idea with remote companies, in the idea of documentation, right? So many remote leaders like yourself, myself, everybody out there, is documentation is crucial, right? And culture and everything else that you do is so foundational to the success of remote companies. Why is that? And like how much and what should companies be documenting and when? Like when they launch the company, do they need to be documenting all these policies and procedures, or is something again at different stages and milestones of the company? Hey, now we should start focusing on documenting whatever it may be.
Everything should be documented, whether it be video documentation or written documentation. And I say that from the aspect of if you're really wanting to be a remote first company and truly honor people being able to design their lives around their work versus the other way around, documentation is the only way to really set those intentions. And part of that as well is assimilation. You know, if you have an employee who's in New York and is very well versed in kind of culture and they have a lot of like multicultural experiences and they've traveled a lot, like they may have a little bit more worldly view of how people operate and interact with one another. Whereas you may have somebody in a tiny town in South America who has never been outside of their town. They've never been on a plane before. They may not interact in the same way as that person in New York does. And those two people work on the same team. So what are your cultural standards? How do you treat one another? What is permitted at the company? Because those people actually won't know how to work well together to deliver the product, to deliver the profit, unless as a company, you define what that shared cultural experience is when they log in together. And I'm going to give an example. Taxstar was a tax company, right? A lot of people had been coming from very rigid state organizations, clock in, clock out, someone on your shoulder the whole time, like very micromanagement. Not everybody, just a few. I had a teammate come to me their first week via Zoom and ask me what they needed to do if they had to go to the bathroom. They were in their 40s. They were at home. That tells us everything, right? That tells us you have to give the people permission to actually live their lives, because a subset of employees have never actually had that type of freedom at work. And it sounds so simple and it sounds so kind of Sesame Street, but we're literally relearning how to work. And we have to write down what that operating system is, and what is implicit needs to be made explicit. So if I ask a team that I'm consulting, hey, how do you, if you're on product and you are collaborating with somebody in marketing, walk me through how that happens. Where does it happen? What's the flow? And if you can't give me an answer, that means it's not documented. And that means that process is taking 10 times as long as it would need to take, wasting 10 times as much of the company's money and employees' energy if you took the time to write down that process so it's referenceable, standardized for everybody. Doesn't mean it can't evolve, doesn't mean you can't change it. But unless people take what's out of their brains and are able to write it down or record a loom or create some sort of ecosystem where that behavior lives, it is all up to the assumption of how that person's past experience has been at work.
Yeah, I love the case. I won't say I love it, but appreciate the case of the 40-year-old person from the state tax departments and asking what the process of getting permission to go to the bathroom was. I had an earlier episode this season, kind of the opposite side of during the pandemic, they were hiring Gen Zs, and one person, I guess a Gen Z person, asked, is like, what's the policy around including emojis when I speak to my boss? Right? I guess that's when you're talking with your friends, it's emojis and acronyms and things like that. Is that acceptable business behavior? And like, who would think these things? But somebody's experiencing this, and the idea of, right, here's a best practice. It's written, accessible to everybody, and it's not just stuck in one person as sitting on their own island thinking, can I do this? Can I not do this? Because they're probably not the only one. And in future, right, if you hire, maybe in that case, more Gen Zs, that question is probably going to come up over and over again as you continue to hire.
Absolutely. And I'll give an example from my own experience too, working in tech in San Francisco. I came from bars and restaurants. I came from like high-end bartending and hospitality. And in our office, in many tech Silicon Valley offices, there's a beer fridge. There are wine taps, right? Like it's part of the environment. And I remember my first week, I was pretty young. I grabbed a beer at lunch. That was from my background. That was a very, very normal thing to do in my industry. And I got reprimanded very publicly and shamed that wasn't something we do here. But there's a beer fridge that's open 24 hours a day. What's telling me that that's not okay? So again, that person, I'm sure they didn't mean to shame me in any way, shape, or form. And I learned that lesson very quickly, that it wasn't appropriate till after 5 p.m. But because of my background in years in an industry that was very normal, that I was embarrassed. And so a lot of this is really just realizing that when we hire remotely, specifically, the difference in prior experience and work life and city life is not shared in hardly any capacity. And so those nuances become even more essential to helping people feel comfortable, feel like they belong, and help them navigate the environment that you've decided that you want to run and they've decided to join.
That's absolutely priceless. One of the first things that companies tend to put down in documentation, whether it's remote or not, are company values or virtues that are supposed to align, the team and the grand mission. For, we'll call remote companies, what should those, let's say, remote-focused values be focused on? And how can companies really help align their team and connect their team to those values on a day-to-day or a regular basis?
Well, number one, the values should be intrinsically held by the founders and leadership team. If those founding teams and leaders I see often will create values of who they want to be, not who they actually are. And then they actually end up not recognizing themselves in the culture and they aren't able to champion it. And I think that's number one, the most important thing to think about. Whatever your values are, whatever they choose to be, they need to be intrinsically, you need to be intrinsically motivated by them if you are part of a founding team, part of a leadership team. So that's just number one. I think any value that is surrounded around trust is massive. So one thing I would really encourage companies to do is Shalom Schwartz, he's a researcher did an incredible paper on the theory of universal human values. And there's basically 10 different kind of umbrellas of values that everybody shares across any culture and any belief system. And starting to see, what values do you feel like resonate with your team there? Like, are you a team that's really likes to build relationships? Are you a team that likes to work really on your own, very autonomously? Are you a team that really wants to create a space of belonging? And so again, I think it comes back to, who are we and who do we want to grow up as? And then crafting those values around that. And again, importantly, is remote doesn't kill culture, it reveals it. And the only thing holding companies together as a compass, I would say, is the values and the behaviors that are attached to them. And one more thing I will say around values is, when companies are either going through a values exercise or elevating their values or deciding what their values are, whatever that might be, they need to be co-created. Because again, you can't just say, here are our values, but then no one recognizes themselves in them. And then writing about 3 to 4 sentences underneath each values of defining what that value means. Because again, values can be interpreted. And you want to do your best as a company or as a people leader to make sure the values are as defined as possible to the nature of your company, to really scale within that frame, because you don't want values to be misinterpreted.
I love that idea that you mentioned towards the end of 3 or 4 sentences, and even kind of potentially the collaboration. Like, if one of your values is, consistently learning, just throw some kind of wild idea out there.
Sure.
Giving everyone the opportunity, what exactly does continually learning mean for you? And for one person means, how do I get better at the job that I'm doing? Or another person, how do I get better job that I want within the same company? Or how do I want to go for the next thing? And everyone puts in, and based on that, like defining truly what it means to continually grow based on, let's say, all those sentences or answers that everyone gives. I think that's actually quite fascinating. Here's my favorite question.
One of the cool things. Oh,
no, please, no. No, go.
Awesome. One thing I can say to folks out there who might be going through a values reevaluation process, which I think happens pretty often for a lot of companies, especially now that people are really honing in on remote, is take the values you already have and ask people to define them for you. Ask your team to define, what does it mean here? Like, literally, your people have all of the answers already. And if you have somebody who can honor that process and kind of project manage that research process and aggregate the data to start finding the commonalities, you'll have no problem evolving the values in a way that people intrinsically act within them. And that's a thing I don't think that we do enough. We don't ask our people who already have the answers.
Well, that gets me into my next question, which is probably my favorite question about culture. And when, again, you tend to hear some rigid answers and which not. Who owns company culture? Is it people ops?
Everybody.
Is it the C-suite? Or is the correct answer, like the one that I would also give, it's everybody?
Culture is co-created. Culture is co-created. It is the responsibility of every single person in a company to honor, stay accountable to, and evolve the culture. And every 7 people that you add to a company, the culture will shift. So I think one thing to note in kind of the ownership piece is the importance of cultural alignment in leadership, because those leaders, they don't own it. Everybody owns it. But in a lot of ways, leaders need to shepherd and model it. And so that's why really hiring leaders who are super culturally aligned is so important, to then be able to scale that culture, that dominant culture, and you don't have these subcultures that start to break off and to really start to look very different than the rest of the company.
Beautifully said. Next, interrelated to that, I would love to kind of your insight of what do you think is the real differentiating factor or factors between the world-class remote cultures, Doist, GitLab, and company, and what I'd probably guesstimate is the 70+% of remote companies who are just doing remote these days?
Intention. I mean, it's one word, right? Like, it really is intention. It's what I see in every one of those 70% of companies that I've spoken to or consulted on is there is very little intention in how they want to do remote. And many companies are stuck in a cycle of just lifting and shifting what they've experienced in the office. And they say, now we're remote, versus saying, okay, do we need to hire somebody or a team specifically to intentionally redesign our operating system, redesign the way we work, help shift our mindset into a new operating rhythm? And I think we're going to be stuck in this kind of push and pull. I'm going to give us another 2 to 5 years, probably, is my gut there.
Thank you.
But I think that's really the difference. It's intention, and it's intentional hiring for a work experience team who is fully focused on the re-architecture. You want to build a new office, so you want to do a remodel on your office. You hire a team, you hire a contractor, you hire interior designers, you hire people to build those rooms, and then people will walk through them in the way they are designed. It is the exact same thing with remote.
That's so awesome. Again, these are things I've been saying for God knows how long. It's I think this is the third season, I guess towards the end of the third season. Again, obviously, no surprise. The number one word that's come up when it comes to remote work is intentionality, right? On every single episode, intentionality. Yes, 70% of those companies who are doing remote are obviously not doing it the right way because yes, they're not intentional. And exactly what you said, and I've been preaching this for like 3 damn years. Now that you're remote, or you're going to be hybrid, or whatever you were thinking you're going to be, you need to completely redesign how your company operates, how you hire and onboard and mentor and learning development and engagement and all those different things for a remote environment, because it's totally different and it doesn't work the same way. It's not going to work the same way. And almost nobody's done that. And it kind of, for me, aligns into obviously hiring of, I had an episode, it was either early this season or last season with Tyler Selhorn on the topic of the head of remote. I'm a big believer. The head of remote is the new COO, right? The person who's coming in, and I've interviewed for a bunch of these roles. I've talked to a lot of recruiters and founders and things, and seemingly what most companies had hired was someone with 3 to 4 years of total experience, all tend to be within people ops. And really what they're looking for was, hey, what tools do we use? And I'm like, that's not what you want. Really what you need is, right, a COO, someone who's had that experience, obviously long before the pandemic, who's built and scaled remote teams, who has that cross-organizational experience, who can understand the interconnectedness of finance and IT and legal and HR and people and culture and all those different things. Someone who's experienced and understands how all those things are connected, right? If you have an IT person, IT security person saying, hey, we need to be more secure, and now that we're not within the company network, we're potentially at risk, so we need to put better security software in there. And all of a sudden, like, okay, that made sense. But if someone included, hey, we should be like monitoring our employees in some capacity, someone who has that maybe IT experience would say, yes, no, that makes sense, right? Good to monitor employees and make sure they're not putting the company at risk. But you need the person who also has the culture and people ops experience, who says,
if we do that, how will that affect?
Exactly. Like company, exactly. Company culture wise, like that's terrible. Or my favorite argument is salary, right? Global salary or local salary. And for me, it's right. I'm a big believer in global compensation. You pay for the contribution that the company gets. So if you're doing the same exact job, contributing the same exact thing, it shouldn't matter where the hell in the world you're sitting. The company getting the same thing out of Darcy, and I'm getting the same thing from Scott. Both of you should get paid the same thing versus different. Because I said, hey, I mean, how would I feel knowing that Darcy gets paid twice as much because she lives in California, but I'm doing the same exact job? That culturally, so from a finance perspective, yeah, of course we want to pay Scott half as much because he lives wherever. But from that culture piece, it's like, culturally, how does that work? And not so many people have that experience. And I think, again, part of where we're going to come out, and I've said multiple times, and I think we're actually going to get maybe that in one of my next questions, we have at least another 18 to 24 months of quite a bumpy ride, right? Pandemic, thankfully, has has pushed us into remote. Okay, the world understands a remote. We've done remote. But again, most companies are not doing a remote the right way. And it's going to be kind of trudging through this experience. And I think the companies are going, unfortunately, to have the upper hand for part of the time because of just what the economy is in. But once like the economy starts turning around, then for me, it's right. The whole argument of return to office that we're still unfortunately happening, right? 18 to 24 months from now, that's done. Nobody talks about that anymore. The next thing is going to be like, what? There's synchronous meetings, there's synchronous communication. Like I can't live my life and be happy and just get the work I need to get done. Like, thanks, but no thanks.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think we're also in this interesting space right now of fractional. So I'm currently serving as a fractional head of remote for a client on a 6-month contract. And I've seen a lot of demand for it. I know there's a lot of what's happening is a lot of people in our space, Scott, and I think you've done this, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of people in our space who've been in the remote space for longer than the pandemic and have kind of that muscle built on what it can be, like how amazing it can be if it's done. And I don't want to say right. I want to say done in a way that's supportive to so many different people's lives, so many different experiences. Like how do we create that cohesive experience where people can design their lives around their work versus the other way around? And, this fractional gig is interesting. It's interesting because there aren't enough people, I would say, that I know of. I could be totally wrong. Maybe I'm missing hundreds of thousands of people out there that have this skill set, and I put my foot in my mouth if I am. But there's almost this need to have fractional folks in the space to help people realize what they actually need. Like that's what I'm seeing the appetite from companies. They're saying, oh my gosh, they have a champion on their people ops team. They have a champion on their leadership team that's like, we need this. And headcount's like, nah, we don't. We're doing fine. We're working well remotely. Don't worry about it because the noise isn't there yet. Like It's the office talk right now. Like the noise isn't there yet. And so it's been really interesting to be in this space and to talk to other fractional executives. I think we're all saying the same thing. It's like, oh, wow. Okay. Now you showed me that I need this. Now we know we need it. Now we can get headcount for it. And so that's been a really, really fascinating kind of trajectory. And I think we're going to stay in that fractional space for a while as companies. They just want a little taste. They want to know, what's it going to be like? What do we actually need? Can we test this out? And it brings some really interesting things to the surface.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And again, I think one of the episodes I had in season 2 with a fellow Jorah Poleg was on this kind of connection between the crypto and the future of work. And like that was one of the points of these fractional people who like you have your core team, but you have the fractional people that come in and come out. And I definitely agree with the sense of, hey, maybe someone's been a mentor or kind of a consultant here and there and has brought something to light where it's come internally, hey, we need this. And I believe like the head of remote is probably that perfect example. Because I say for myself, right, I was the first hire in a vision.
Yeah.
We're literally the first hire there back in 2012. I helped build and scale the company, eventually grew to like 1,000 people. $2 billion. Yeah. No, I scaled the early years of it. How many people in the world exist with that amount of experience?
Right.
Maybe 2 hands, like your CEO, your first operations hire, like in a company back then, and there aren't so many of them. So I think that person who has that much experience building, scaling remote companies and all those bits and pieces, I think companies are going to get there. And to that point of, hey, because that was my question with this head of remote. Are companies looking maybe for these people more junior with less strategy, more transaction, because they don't think that unicorn exists? They don't think people have actually built and scaled remote companies before the pandemic, when they're obviously people are like us. And maybe when they realize, hey, there are some people who've done it, and that becomes like that unicorn hire. Hey, okay, we now need to embrace this again, more out of necessity because we're being forced to versus we want to. So we need this person to kind of come in, lay the groundwork, lay the foundation, like lay the plumbing, and then then bring in a bigger team of maybe more transactional people, but at least having that structure. Talking about the future.
I mean,
I cut you off again. I'm sorry.
That definitely exists. No. I mean, was that the question? Like, I think that's what people are looking for at the moment, and I think, but the other layer to that is the bumpy waters and kind of the bumpy road that we're talking about is the 70% of companies you mentioned are, I would say are mostly in that camp of reactionary remote. So there's actually a layer of deep change behavioral management that needs to happen versus this, we're starting as a remote first company. We know what that means. We've defined that, which frankly, I think you could probably hire a more junior person in, because you have blue ocean space. You're not dealing with kind of all of this different behavioral change. Everybody's behaving within the same sort of, ideally, if you've hired, right, and you've started to write your culture down within the same ecosystem, and you don't have all of these different interpretations of what does remote mean here? What did it mean before? What is like, so there's that muddy road of the companies that are already in it. And then there's like this amazing, like, I can't wait to work with these people.
Yep.
This like train that's about to come down the track of these amazing founders, and hopefully from a lot of these tech layoffs. Like, there are brilliant people who have been laid off from a lot of these companies, and small companies too, that I really hope start remote first companies. And they say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it because we knew it sucked this other way, and we're going to do it right. And that's where I think in the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to see like some seriously cool stuff come down the road.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, would any company founder that's launching a company today, would they really decide from now, hey, I want to be a hybrid company? No, nobody would want to do that. Okay, so 18 to 24 months. Let's look into the crystal ball. Let me tell us what you're thinking. We're going to be seeing culture-wise, remote-wise, whatever you think in the next 18 to 24 months.
I think we are going to have employee experience design teams. I think like that would be a dream of mine. I saw a role the other day that popped up around that. I think that that's going to be really fascinating. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more investment in employee journey mapping. So as it mirrors kind of the customer experience, what does that look like? Which I would love to see. Again, that hospitality lens, like to be a competitive employer in this market, especially with the data that's come out for Gen Z. You know, you see in your remote company, you see, many, and I can't speak for all of Gen Z. I'm not Gen Z, but what I read is, oh, well, we're not getting enough connection at work. Well, that's probably because it's not designed for you to have connection. Like, it's not about that you're not getting it. It's that the company culture actually wasn't designed for you to have it. And so it come back to that design process. Like, I want to see employee experience design teams. Head of people and culture should not be doing all of the compliance, all of the HR stuff, everything. Like, this is a solely focused role of work experience. And what is that experience that we are creating cohesively and collectively as a holistic experience, whether you're hybrid or remote first, it doesn't matter. But that focus, I think, is going to just boom in the next 18 to 24 months.
Totally on board. So I'll ask you a question related to that. For this team, or let's say if it's an individual person, head or remote experience, where does that person fit in the organization chart? Because I want to go through an experience that I had, but I would love to hear your answer first.
Yeah, it depends. And I think it depends on the size of the organization. And it depends on at what point they hire that person. It's a highly cross-functional role. And unless there's a design team that already exists, I say I like to see it under operations, so reporting to the CEO. So really, so it needs to have a lot of influence on executive team. So reporting between CEO and CHRO or CPO. So really that cross-functional, you're the bridge between the CEO and the people ops team. And then I see a lot of build out within that team itself. So people analytics a lot of times will report to that team. So you can have the analytics to really understand how to make the changes that the company needs to change. So again, operations, but with a heavy, like 60% operations, 40% people ops.
That was my answer. And again, yeah, I mean, which tends to be not the answer I always get. So I was interviewing for a head of remote role, and they weren't sure. At the same time, they had just hired a new VP of HR or people ops, and they weren't sure, was this head of remote going to report into the COO or the new head of people. And so I was speaking with the CEO multiple times. I said, okay, regardless if this works between us, I said that role, that person needs to report directly to you. And I kept an answer, like multiple times I spoke with this person. I said, because there's going to be times, and you have to be prepared now, what's going to be happen when you have a conflict between, on one side, scaling a company, right? The person, like maybe the HR person has more experience there, versus building a world-class remote culture, right? That was their big drive. We want to be the next GitLab. We want to be the next Doist. We want to build the best world-class culture, this and that. I said, there's going to be times, especially this VP of HR came from the office-based world, where there's going to be a conflict. And again, the example I kept bringing up was this salary difference, right? Now you want to hire globally, whatever. The HR person, in theory, had experience at whatever companies they were with of hiring, let's say in hubs in London and wherever. So they paid localized salary based on whatever hub, and they hired in hubs specifically. And that's great when you're trying to scale a company. But if you're now looking on the other side, I want to build a world-class remote culture. The hub thing really may not work. Again, outside of the reason we spoke in the beginning, but the pay now comes into play. If you're hiring in South America or Buenos Aires because you can pay a designer or whatever it is, half that you can pay them, well, that's not a world-class remote culture. Like, that's a pretty crappy culture. So I said to the CEO, like, what happens then, right? If this person reports into the head of HR, most likely you're going to hire in hubs. So what happens then? Like, they need to come directly to you, to the COO, because you're the one that has to understand like what the impact is on finance, on HR, on all these other pieces to get the big picture.
If you're going to make these decisions, if you're going to make these decisions, here are the consequences. Make whatever decisions you want. And I think that's what it's coming back to. And it comes back down to writing your culture down, right? Like, and defining who you want to be. If you are going to make these decisions and your goal is to be a world-class remote culture, you need to know how these decisions are going to affect that. And you need a voice of reason and a voice to help guide the cohesive leadership team to make those decisions in alignment, but also to bring the data to the table and to bring the insight to the table to, fine, do whatever you want. But if you make these decisions, it is going to take you from the world-class remote culture you think you may have down a few notches. Are you okay with that?
Yeah. So the last question I have is kind of like a two-sided or two-part question. I want to kind of leave the listeners off with, again, I always try to have specific action steps they can take. So for company executives that are, again, part of this 70% of remote companies just doing remote, what are the three most important things that they should be thinking about or working on to improve their company and company culture in 2023? Kind of part one. And similarly, for, let's say, the individual managers, middle managers, lower managers at these same companies, who they themselves are embracing, they think, hey, async makes sense, 4-day work week, and they want to embrace the best that the future work has to offer. But again, the company isn't there yet. What are, let's say, 3 easy wins that they can implement themselves as individual managers, wherever they are, that can have an impact on, let's say, just their individual teams?
Okay, there are 2 questions here. So I'm going to start with the founders. Right?
Go for it. Yes, it was really 2 questions. I wanted to mold it into one, but yes, let's pull it back.
That's okay. I might have you repeat the second one. So for founders, number 1, manage your psychology. I mean, I think that's the number 1 thing. Ben Horowitz talks about this. It's the number 1 thing a founder needs to do when working remotely. It's managing your psychology and always checking yourself. And I think number 2 is getting in alignment with the rest of your leadership team on what type of remote culture you want. And what are you putting out there? And does it match the behaviors in which you are behaving? And does it align with your future plans? And again, I think that's the other thing. Like, there's no right or wrong remote culture. It's what you decide as a company you want to offer, and then advertising it that way and honoring it. So those are 2 huge things. And I think number 3 is leading by example. Once you've made those decisions, really, really working hard to challenge yourself to live within those bounds and to exemplify that behavior. Because if you say, okay, we are a very family friendly remote culture. We don't mind when kids come into the room. It's no problem if your baby's on your lap. Fine. This is just an example. But then you start saying sorry the second your kid walks into a room. You're now not honoring the culture that you said you have and that you want to exemplify. So I think that's a very small thing, but can actually make a massive behavioral difference if you pay attention to those moments, especially in imagery and in videos. So those are the top 3 things I would say for a founder. For kind of the individual manager that knows this is the future of work, and can you repeat the question just one more time to make sure I hit the points?
Absolutely. So for those managers who are working for the 70% of companies just doing remote, again, not doing it the right way, and they themselves say, hey, this future work thing, like this is totally it. Like we totally get async, we totally get the 4-day work week, we totally get the idea of deep work and being focused on contribution, whatever all IRLs. And so what the best that the future of work has to offer. What are like 3 easy things that those individual managers can implement within their specific teams? Again, the whole company may not yet be changing. So the whole company may not, let's say, be embracing the 4-day work week. But an individual manager understands, hey, for 4-day work week to actually be possible, we need to be async by default. So maybe I don't have the ability for cross-team meetings to do async, but hey, you know what? My team meetings or my one-on-ones, like the work portion of those, like I've done with my teams, we're moving async to those. So I can embrace the best within my specific team. So we'll have maybe like 3 easy wins for those individual managers.
Yeah, I'd say number 1, get on a call with your team and ask your team the type of culture that your team wants, right? Like if you have a team that really wants to be highly asynchronous, like again, your people have the answers. And I think that we know that culture is co-created and you can have subcultures on teams. And so there's no problem. Number 1, ask your team, ask your individual team members, are there certain hours of day they love to work and certain hours they hate to work? Could you maybe schedule the one synchronous meeting that needs to happen within those overlap hours? So I think, again, just mine for information, number 1. Number 2, create a space where different people can belong. And so again, that's really, really important. If you notice that people aren't talking up in meetings, maybe they're more introverted. So again, have these conversations with your teammates and say, how do you work best? And how can I shepherd you to work best remotely? So I think those are 2, again, very simple things to just ask people what they like. And then you may not be able to give them everything they like, but you can help. Again, you're a designer. And I think people don't realize that as a leader, you are a people experience designer. I don't care if you're in engineering. I don't care if you're in marketing. You design the experience of your team and you have a lot of power and you have a lot of people with the answers. So those are 2 quick things. I would say number 3, again, very simple. Have an auto check-in with your team every week that just says, what did you do for you this week? Give people permission to just live their lives. And the more that you do that, I guarantee you, the more connected you will probably see them be to you and the culture.
There's just so much goodness in this past hour plus that we've recorded. It's been fantastic. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show today and sharing the amazing wisdom that you've been already sharing, on social media and other places. So thank you so much for joining today. For people who are listening, want to get in touch with you, want to learn more about you, learn about more of the coaching work that you're doing, what's the best way for people listening to get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So please find me on LinkedIn. That's the best place to find me. So just search Darcy Boles, DarcyBoles. I'm sure Scott will, I'm sure you will put some notes in the show notes. And then feel free to join my email list. So just go to my website, shiftwithdarcymarie.com and sign up for my email list there. There's some cool stuff coming out this year, just in terms of culture development and kind of tips and tricks to really keep your teams connected as we navigate these really muddy waters. You've got some people out there like me and Scott and a lot of our network who really want to help and would love to connect with you. So thank you so much, Scott. This was really fun. And I'm really stoked we were finally able to record this podcast through the crazy holidays and all of this. And it's awesome to see you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for the time. It was fantastic conversation. And for everybody listening, until next time, have a wonderful day. thank you so much for tuning into today's show. I really hope you enjoyed it. My aim is for everyone listening to have one takeaway from each episode they can then go and use with their teams. If you enjoyed the show, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, on our YouTube channel, share it with friends and colleagues, and please feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website.